Hello, everyone. Welcome back to the Perry Ekimai channel, where we are going through answering LDS truth claims, addressing the LDS truth claim series by Brett McDonald. In our last episode, we discussed at length Brett McDonald's arguments for why the informal witnesses provide convincing, under a reasonableness standard, evidence for LDS truth claims regarding the existence of the plates, which were reported to be in Joseph Smith's possession. We did find over the course of that conversation that both of the arguments that McDonald had presented were riddled with fallacies and were ultimately unsound and invalid. And in this next part here, we'll begin following McDonald as he starts to treat the three witnesses, beginning with most likely the most controversial, or arguably the most controversial of the three witnesses, Martin Harris. And while McDonald does spend a fair bit of time discussing the claims made about Martin's character, about the Anthon affair, similar historical issues, what I'm more concerned with in this series is the actual arguments that McDonald makes for presenting or for developing his positive case for LDS truth claims. I'm not as interested in litigating every single historical document or claim, but rather what the actual presentation of the evidence that McDonald gives has to say about the associated claims. So this is largely because even if Martin Harris is just the most trustworthy, most consistent, most bestest person who ever existed in human history, we would still have to deal with whether or not this specific claim about the plates is actually true, and whether or not the claims that he makes here are actually reliable as well. So McDonald's first arguments here really begin on the basis of talking about a few different aspects of trying to impeach a witness. This framing is a little bit interesting, potentially problematic, as it appears to try to put the burden on the critic to be able to impeach Martin's character, or to be able to impeach Martin Harris or the other three witnesses as witnesses, rather than actually dealing with what the strength of the claim that the witnesses are making actually is. Again, this goes back to, even if we can't impeach Martin Harris, even if Martin Harris is completely unimpeachable as a witness, that may or may not actually indicate that his claims are correct. McDonald's first argument about Harris is that he could not be impeached for character because there is no evidence of Martin being dishonest. This argument limits the concept of character down to mere honesty. I don't think that that's actually a complete picture of a person's character. It is possible that this is sufficient in a legal context. I'm not a lawyer, but for our purposes here, I think that how credulous a person is a facet of that person's character that is important to understand. And that honesty in and of itself is not sufficient for describing a person's character and rendering them unimpeachable. The record of Martin's life shows that he is a tremendously credulous person. He latches onto a lot of different movements, a lot of different esoteric traditions and folk magic. He ends up running with a few different breakoffs of the LDS movement, especially during the succession crisis, before eventually settling back with the Brighamites. Harris is just a pretty credulous person. If we look at we'll look even at the sources that McDonald presents in here. And I think that does go to his character. McDonald continues his arguments by arguing that Harris is unimpeachably competent, specifically in matters of business and law. And this largely is undisputed by critics as well. It's not particularly relevant. And we are not talking about matters of business or community or law here. We are talking about Martin's competence in terms of assessing a miracle claim. And that is a different category of competence. A person may be competent in some areas and not in others. And Martin is competent, or Martin is a decent businessman. He's an upstanding member of the community. This does not mean that he isn't deficient in other areas, that he's not incompetent in other spaces. In fact, in many of the quotes that McDonald shares, affirmations of Harris's acumen for business or his beneficence to the community is followed really just in the next breath with a statement about his incompetence when it came to visions or claims about the supernatural. Fret not, McDonald has prepared for this. He presents a critical argument that reads Thusly, 1. Harris was an unstable, gullible, and superstitious man. 2. Unstable, gullible, and superstitious men can be caused to see a vision of an angel and physical objects in broad daylight. 3. Joseph Smith could cause people to see visions. And finally, 4. Joseph Smith could have caused Martin to see a vision of an angel and physical objects in broad daylight. This is supposed to be the critical argument that McDonald is now going to knock down. This argument does appear to be valid. I would contend that it is a straw man, however. First, the use of the adjective unstable does seem deliberately inflammatory and really isn't necessary to actually make this argument work. Second, the word gullible has a negative connotation, which in and of itself may bias someone who is uh, not disposed to the critical position to have an emotional reaction. Credulous is the word that I prefer here. I find that word is more neutral. The historical record really does seem to corroborate that Harris was both credulous and superstitious. It's much more difficult to show gullibility uh, in the record. With these clarifications made, premise 1 here does seem to hold up. I wouldn't make the second argument or the second premise. It's just not a position that I would hold. And if I were to see like another critic basically saying that credulous and superstitious men can be caused to see visions of angels and physical objects, I'd probably actually push back against that as an argument. Instead, what I would change that to is that credulous and superstitious people are more likely to be predisposed to reporting visionary experiences. And then I would add as an additional premise in this argument that visionary experiences are most likely explained as hallucinations or false reports. From here, we arrive at premise 3, which is where McDonald claims that there is no evidence to support this proposition, this critical argument. As this premise is stated in this particular critical argument that McDonald has put forward, I would agree with McDonald. This is part of the reason why I would not make this argument as a critic. And this is also why I see this argument overall as a straw man of the critical position. Let's see if there's a bit of a way that we can actually change this premise into something that is more defensible and more of a steel man of the critical position. How about instead we try? Charismatic people are often able to convince credulous and superstitious people that the latter, the credulous and superstitious person, has experienced a supernatural event. Then we would be able to make a more modest claim Joseph Smith was a charismatic person. Now all we have to do is just clean up the conclusion to read, therefore, Joseph Smith could have convinced Martin Harris that he had experienced a supernatural event. This may not be a perfect version of the argument, but it's a lot better than the straw man version proposed by McDonald. As McDonald notes, and I will agree, however, this argument does argue that Harris was, on supernatural matters, other than competent. With our changes, I do think that this argument now goes to challenge Martin's competency quite well. We'll go ahead and move on now to Harris's biases. As McDonald contends, there are 3 reasons why someone would be a co-conspirator with Joseph Smith: money, power, and fame. I would contend that there's a 4th reason, and that Brigham Young is a great example of the 4th reason in action. However, for Martin Harris, we are really only interested in one of these reasons, and that is money. Did Harris have a financial bias toward Mormonism? Harris had mortgaged his farm to help fund the printing of the Book of Mormon. Whether he expected to see a return on his investment, this is still a tremendous financial stake in this claim. And McDonald does try to contend that Harris was not ever actually seeking a profit. I am not trying to challenge that particular claim. I'm not interested in litigating those particular documents. Rather, I'm interested in taking what McDonald argues at more or less face value and contend whether or not it actually meets the standards of evidence that we're looking for. And since Harris had spent so much money and invested so much into the movement, this can largely be seen as a form of the sunk cost fallacy, or of sunk cost. He had already invested this in. This is going to create a bias. McDonald argues that because the profits never came, there's no contract, or there's no evidence for a contract for profits on the sale of the Book of Mormon, that somehow this absolves Harris of financial bias. And I completely reject that notion. The very act of sinking funds into the project, whether he expected a profit or not, is enough to constitute a financial stake and therefore a financial bias in the outcome. So this particular financial bias is most likely going to predispose Harris to confirmation bias. And this actually fits really well with the narrative that we get about the lost 116 pages, about the pages being lost and about the story that Joseph Smith ultimately spends back to try and resolve that, and how Harris is brought around on that and does not continue to hold a critical eye on that particular issue. It also fits with the outcome of the Anthon affair. I mean, ultimately, what McDonald concludes his discussion about the Anthon affair is by contending that somebody has to be lying. This may or may not be the case. An explanation where nobody is lying whatsoever in this particular occurrence in the Anthon affair is that we can imagine that Martin Harris goes to see Charles Anthon. This happened as part of the historical record, and that we can then say, okay, events transpire largely as Anthon describes. So in this particular scenario, we are holding that Anthon is being honest, and that the events as they transpired are largely how Anthon describes them. During Harris's journey back, he is flustered, he's annoyed, he's frustrated about this whole experience of engaging with these scholars and not really getting the answer he was hoping to get. And he begins to have his memories of the event sincerely changed. Brains do this. We remember things differently after they occurred all the time. As he eventually gets back, then, as Harris gets back to Joseph, he communicates this story to Joseph Smith in this sort of altered state, in this altered brain state. And then Joseph helps Harris to calm down, and over time will eventually reveal to Martin 2 Nephi 27 and this sort of amended story based off of Isaiah 29. And it is important to note that 2 Nephi 27 does not come out until about a year after the Anthon affair, roughly. So the story gets changed a little bit in Martin's brain further. Now, in 1838, when Joseph is trying to kind of regain control of a spiraling situation, he publishes his personal history. This includes the version of Martin Harris's story meeting Charles Anthon that we really refer to on the record these days. But he doesn't have Harris involved to provide correction or oversight. Harris is outside of the church at this point, or outside of Smith's version of direction of the church. And instead of this game, in this game of telephone that's going on, describing 10-year-old events, Joseph describes events more in line with 2 Nephi 27, which has now had some impact on how Harris is remembering the story than it does even with the original version of the story as Harris would have told him. And since it's passed through so many changes at this point, the version that we have in the record is no longer lining up with Anthon's version of events. Nobody has done anything necessarily dishonest. They may be doing this all entirely honestly. It may be that Joseph Smith, as in his efforts to calm down Harris, is sincerely engaging with Isaiah, which he was wont to do, and sees a similar type of story, or at least reads into Isaiah 29 a similar sort of story that he then brings into the Book of Mormon, and that changes his own perceptions of Martin's story. And in that sense, we can have an altered version of events where we have multiple people that are describing things as they occur, or their version of how things occurred in different ways, with none of them actually lying, with none of them being intentionally dishonest. So McDonald contends that if Anthon is the one who's telling the truth, it would require the critic to claim fraud as opposed to mass hallucination. I don't understand why he's making this particular argument. This is the first time, as far as I can tell, that McDonald uses this implicit argument that does end up plaguing much of the rest of his presentation here of Martin Harris, namely that somehow, some way, the conspiracy and hallucination models are incompatible. I don't know why McDonald does not consider the option that these are really just tools, that where it was appropriate or available to Joseph to use conspiracy. Conspiracy was used where hallucination was of benefit. Hallucination was used. And as much as even that could be induced or just something that people were motivated to seek after, lots of ways that hallucinations can come about. Uh, Again, I don't see why McDonald doesn't consider these as tools rather than as these strict binaries that have to be kept separate. This is really beyond me on that. We'll see it show up many times in the next section and in the final part of the Harris argument. In his next argument, McDonald contends that critics have no unified theory for impeaching Harris. He pits the fraud and mass hallucination theories against each other. This argument may have been salient in 2016. Honestly, I doubt it. But in the current year, I really don't see it working. As noted earlier, Harris was perfectly capable of to present like an incorrect version of events without doing so deceitfully. And Harris could have been a co-conspirator who was brought into the fold through hallucinatory experiences. These ideas really are not self-contradictory. And given some of the additional research that's been done on potential origins, potential naturalistic origins, to whatever extent of credence you want to give, there does not really necessarily exist this strict binary of these two ideas, of these two modalities being in actual competition with each other. McDonald presents an argument here then for Martin's reliability as a witness. So turning it around now from talking about impeaching Martin Harris to actually saying, you know what, this is a stand-up dude. He contends that Harris was an honest and prosperous citizen for 30 years and that even his critics say so. He says that Harris lost money, gained no position, and severed his relationship with Joseph Smith, marginalizing himself within the community, and that he challenges then like some of the critical ideas here, that excommunication serves as evidence for reliability vice impeachment. He says that Harris was deceived. He basically runs down this version of a critical argument that I, again, would see as a straw man, that Harris was deceived or part of a conspiracy with Joseph Smith, that Harris rejects the church and his relationship with Smith for decades. Harris had no reason at this time to continue the conspiracy, and that he was somehow incentivized to admit the deception, that despite those incentives, Harris never denies his testimony. And then he's like, and then the critic argues that Harris is unreliable. And I have never heard a critic make this particular argument. I don't know who McDonald is citing here for that. I would disagree with if the critic were to make this exact argument, I would disagree with that. We'll get into that. And then continues, Harris convinced hundreds by his testimony, which he maintained for over half a century. And then in conclusion, it is reasonable, therefore, to accept Martin Harris as a reliable witness for his claim. Being about, I believe, then the existence of the plates, though McDonald is not, at least in this particular framing, 100% clear on what he means by Harris's claim. So how do we fare? Well, we've already dealt with the first two premises, frankly, earlier in the discussion. Harris may have been an honest person, but he was also deeply credulous. He may not have made money, but he did have a financial stake in the Book of Mormon and the Mormonism movement broadly. And his credulity and superstitiousness made him a ripe target for deception. There is this pervasive, erroneous notion in LDS thought that their church is this unbroken chain that ties directly back to the start of the Restoration, and that they represent the church in the parlance of the Restoration. These ideas are pretty well incorrect. The succession crisis following the death of Joseph Smith breaks the chain, though I am sure we'll get more into that later on in this series. The other line holds true regardless the outcome of that conversation. Regardless of what we come up with in that particular conversation about the succession crisis, what will hold true is that Mormonism has been about more than Joseph Smith and the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints to a lot of people in the Restoration movement throughout history. Harris's excommunication did not mean that he had left Mormonism. It meant that he left Joseph. He was not at all incentivized to break with his testimony at the Book of Mormon. To the contrary, the closest he would come to basically an opportunity or a motivation to deny his testimony was when he dabbled in being a Shaker. But that didn't end up sticking. The idea that Harris had no reason to continue the conspiracy, assuming he was involved in such, is just wrong. At that point, the rest of this argument really just becomes unrecognizable, or if you remove that from this, the rest of this argument is just useless. That Harris convinced hundreds by his testimony does not lead into, therefore, he is a reliable witness. This is an argument ad populum fallacy. Just because a lot of people believe a thing neither means it's true or reliable. It just means that it has some amount of popularity. Ultimately, the conclusion of this argument does not follow from the premises. The premises do not establish the reliability of Martin Harris with respect to the relevant claims. A person who is honest, super honest, and skilled in one area can be an absolute knob in another. Nobel Prize syndrome is a good example of that. Or honestly, Richard Dawkins. If a person losing money but still believing in a thing meant that they were reliable in claiming how good the thing actually is, well, MLMs must be a hell of a lot better than I give them credit for. If convincing a lot of people about something indicated that was true, I mean, honestly, there are far too many evil people convincing a lot of people of really evil crap for this idea to hold any water. So no, from the argument presented here, we cannot conclude that it is reasonable to accept Martin Harris as a reliable witness with respect to his claim. McDonald extends his first argument from the informal witnesses to include this idea that Martin Harris's testimony of the angel and of the plates is reliable. This is now added in as premise C of the old argument 1. And note that he has collapsed some of the earlier premises of premises A and B and the associated B corollaries into premise A. Former C is now B. And on account of what we just discussed, we can just reject the new premise C and continue to hold argument 1 the same as we held it in the last video as invalid and unsound. Argument 2, though, has seen quite a bit more change. It is different enough that I'm going to go ahead and present it all here. I've gone ahead and highlighted the parts of this that are new to this particular version of argument number 2. You can see that there is a change here to premise A. This change to premise A causes the argument to lose its ability to draw the conclusion I, because it doesn't connect the chain together. It leaves available other forms of fraud that Joseph could have employed as well. And this argument just does not need to be rendered in this particular way. This is just how McDonald has chosen to do it, and I am preserving it here. In the last episode, we dealt with premises B and E. The rejection of those premises remains unchanged at the time of this writing. Our first new premise is premise C. There is an underlying assumption in this premise that suggests that Joseph Smith believed it was even possible for someone to translate the characters that he had produced. If the characters in the character document were just meaningless chicken scratch, as some critical arguments might suggest, then Joseph had the perfect response available to Martin just sitting there. They can't translate these characters because it can only be done by the gift and power of God, Martin, which I have, so continue to pay me, continue to support this work. Under this particular model, Joseph did not copy characters. He wrote them out on a piece of paper, and here's the thing, there are ways he could have copied the characters that would have been undeniable, or as close to undeniable as you can get, that they were actually copies. He didn't do it that way. He copied the characters down in a way that would honestly be indistinguishable from a fraud. Freehand writing of it would be the same thing if it were a fraudulent creation, or if it were an actual transcription of what had been written on the plates. As for premise D, this is just pretty much absurd. We have already discussed how it would be possible for scholars to share one story with Martin, for Martin to, in his agitation with these scholars, share a slightly different version, and for Joseph to manipulate things to create a wholly different version of this. And this can be done, as we discussed earlier, without malice or explicit intent to deceive. This point is just erroneous. With premise F, we do introduce a point that we haven't yet discussed. It's one that I expect we'll get to. It's going to get revisited once we discussed Cowdery and Whitmer in the subsequent episodes. The first problem here is that there is no reason to conclude the visions and the voice that they heard in these visions are like identical for each person. The testimony statement that the three sign does not include all the details of what happened that day by really any accounting. And there is, for instance, no mention of Martin going off on his own, which is pretty well established in now all versions that are given based off of the record, the historical record. So there's no reason to conclude that the vision itself between Cowdery and Whitmer was like the same, was completely identical between Cowdery and Whitmer, let alone Harris. It just needed to be similar enough that they could combine the ideas together into what they accepted. And if the details of it all are vague enough, then it's possible they had very different experiences, but just some common themes that they were willing to sign on to. Finally, we'll talk about premise G, which we've already pointed out just does not hold up to scrutiny. Harris does persist in his testimony, to be sure, but this premise ignores a lot of other factors that were influencing Harris from 1837, when he left the church, to his ultimate death. In this discussion, we have seen that McDonald fails to exonerate Harris of the impeachment criteria, failed to establish Harris as an actual credible witness, and failed to produce a valid and sound argument for the LDS truth claims that incorporate the witness of Martin Harris. To McDonald's credit, though, and this is where I really have to praise him, I genuinely love the way that he is building on these arguments. I hope this continues for the rest of the series, that like all this is based off of like slowly building out these arguments into something that's more of a whole, and that by the end we'll have just like a ridiculously long supersized argument or several different supersized arguments. Yeah, so I'm really hoping that by the end of this, we'll be able to look all the way back at the beginning where we started and still see those premises carried over into the final argument. So like for all that I have criticized McDonald on, I really need to commend him for this. This is a top-notch approach. And I really have to commend him for it. It's awesome, and I'm really excited to kind of continue going with it. So there's some praise towards McDonald and genuine praise at that. I love this, and I think this is a really smart approach. It'll be fun to do. It'll be fun to see going forward. But in terms of actually exonerating Harris or for even establishing his credibility, this didn't do it. Now, Harris is the most complicated, shall we say, the most divisive of the three witnesses. From here, the other two are a lot stronger for McDonald's position, and we'll be proceeding with Oliver Cowdery in the next one. Thank you so much for joining me on this one. Don't forget to like, comment, subscribe, and do all of the things, the YouTube things to follow along. And we'll see you with the next one when we start diving into Oliver Cowdery and all of the fun that brings. Take care.